Hello folks, I hope it's all going groovy for you. As you know, if you've been following this channel, I step around locations made famous by music artists and provide information about the related musician. The purpose of each walk is so viewers from all around the world can see what those places look like in up-close detail. So, welcome to this Musical Steps third of 3 movies, predominantly focused on John Lennon's early life, prior to becoming successful with the Beatles. I don't know if you've spotted it in previous Musical Steps episodes, but as I always do with these movies, I utilise relevant lyrics and song titles embedded as part of my narration. Let me know how many you spot in the comments section, and indeed what song titles and lyrics that you would have added to the narration. Anyway, in this final part of the trilogy, we'll look at some of the factors that contributed to both John Lennon and Paul McCartney's personalities. Over the last 6 decades or so, a lot has been negatively said about John Lennon's spiky and occasionally aggressive personality. But I feel what is often overlooked by some people is the emotional damage inadvertently inflicted on him as a child that caused him to react the way he did to some of those around him. That said, in later life, John increasingly recognised his most negative personality flaws and worked hard on subduing them. So, today, as you can see, I'm in the rain at St. Peter's Church in Walton, a place long thought to be the location of John Lennon's first meeting with Paul McCartney. Speaking of rain, there's an old song called "Into Each Life Some Rain Must Fall." It was recorded in 1944 by Ella Fitzgerald, duetting with the Ink Spots as the Second World War was slowly drawing to a close, around 3 years after John Lennon and Paul McCartney were born in the bombed city port of Liverpool. The lyrics of "Into Each Life Some Rain Must Fall" assert everyone will experience difficulty and heartache at some point, and as a result, any subsequent joy experienced can be appreciated all the more as a contrast to the pain endured. In other words, the metaphoric rain that falls in a person's life will inevitably recede at some point, and the sun will shine once again, with all problems washed away. It's a nice lyric and it's a nice sentiment, and it probably holds true for most people. However, I think it largely depends on the severity of the metaphoric rain, and, with that proviso, it cannot be held to be true for everyone. Children from broken homes, as they were once called, do tend to find it very difficult to overcome the pain. It lasts a lifetime. The pain and shame never stop. It's that sort of home that John Lennon lived in as a child. Now, as you can see on this late October Friday afternoon, the statement, "Into each life some rain must fall," is somewhat apt, because there is a fair amount of very heavy and prolonged showers. Though looking around, I can see blue sky too. That means I'll be able to exclaim "Here comes the sun" at appropriate moments. Anyway, I'm here stepping around this St. Peter's Church location that has long been accepted to be the place where John met Paul for the first time. Though new evidence suggests it's not actually accurate that this was the first place that they met. If you want to see where Lennon actually first met McCartney, watch my previous Musical Steps movie to discover the real location. To validate the claim made in that earlier episode, U2 singer Bono says McCartney once told him the same thing. In his autobiography called Surrender, Bono said he was once travelling by car around Liverpool, with McCartney driving him on a magical mystery tour of significant Beatles locations. Bono describes the journey with McCartney going here, there and everywhere around Liverpool as being like Moses giving him a tour of the Holy Land. According to Bono, they drove past a newsagent shop a couple of miles away from St. Peter's Church here in Walton, the place always said to be the place Lennon first met McCartney. And Paul told Bono the newsagent shop was the real location for his first meeting with John. Bono relates how McCartney told him he shared a chocolate bar with Lennon outside the newsagent shop, a little while before the accepted musical folklore version of their first meeting at St. Peter's Church Hall. Adopting the voice of McCartney, Bono says, "See over there, that newsagent. It's changed a bit, but that's where I had my first real conversation with John. John came out of the newsagent where he'd bought a bar of chocolate. He broke it in half and gave me one half. I was amazed because back then, chocolate was really something. Most boys would break off a little square, but John gave me half his bar. In his autobiography, in his mind, Bono points out that the equal sharing of the chocolate bar indicates how John and Paul later equally shared songwriting royalties, despite who actually wrote the song. Anyway, you'll see that newsagent location in the second movie from this trilogy, looking at Lennon and McCartney. Anyway, here, while sheltering from the rain, I'm going to talk about how intense metaphoric rain fell onto the lives of McCartney and Lennon when they both lost their mothers at an early age. Despite the individual pain the metaphoric rain caused them, it brought together two ostensibly different people and formed a bond between them that perhaps would not have been as strong or even existed at all if they hadn't shared independent painful circumstances. In McCartney's lament to Lennon, Here Today, from his album Tug of War, released 2 years after John had been murdered in 1980, Paul sings about the time he and John cried together, thinking about their lost mothers. Paul laments, "What about the night we cried, because there wasn't any reason left to keep it all inside." It's important to remember there was a 20-month age difference between John and Paul. Now, I mention this because schoolboys tend to make lifelong friends with people similar to themselves, and more often than not, with peers of the same age. Even a 1-year age difference is a big gap when around 16 years old. And so, as I say, schoolboys tend to stick to the same year group for friends. That's not to say that different ages and dissimilar backgrounds don't ever come together to form friendships, but it's a lucky break when those factors do collide to form friendships. So, despite the 20-month age difference between Lennon and McCartney, it was the shared painful loss of their mothers that brought John and Paul closer together. So much so they regarded themselves as the two of us. Obviously, nobody present knew on that hot July the 6th Saturday afternoon in 1957, when two slightly different age schoolboys from slightly different social backgrounds officially met up. Nobody present that day knew John and Paul would not only form the biggest band in the world, but also come together to form an intensely close friendship that would, as is often the case, have more ups and downs than the helter-skelter, and more hellos and goodbyes than Dr. Robert's surgery. It seems the stars aligned that day and gave the world the greatest pop songwriting partnership ever. But imagine that Saturday hadn't been a gloriously warm summer's day, and instead, like it is today, it had been raining all those years ago. If it had been raining, would Paul have ridden his bike over to the village fete if it meant he got soaked to the skin? Would the ever fashion-conscious McCartney have risked turning up soaked and not looking cool? Remember, he wore his best cool clothes that Saturday in 1957, as a way of impressing on those he met he wasn't just another young boy. Arguably, if Paul had chosen not to attend the village fete, the course of popular music would not have taken the long and winding road that it did. If Paul had chosen not to attend the fete, July the 6th, 1957 would have been just another day in Walton and totally forgotten about. It's unlikely the Lennon and McCartney friendship would have begun. As indicated earlier in this particular movie and in previous ones from the trilogy, once pre-arranged introductions had been made, the catalyst for Lennon and McCartney's intense friendship was born of a shared tragedy. Both lost their mothers at an early age. It affected John deeply for all his life. Ostensibly, McCartney coped better than Lennon, though I'm not so sure he did cope better than John. Perhaps Paul buried the pain better as a result of him still having his father and siblings living with him after he lost his mother Mary. By contrast, John was emotionally lost after the dreadful road accident that killed his mother Julia. Despite the anger, violence and bravado he used as a defense mechanism, John was literally screaming out for help when he was down throughout his lyrical career. His incipient anger and spiky personality was exacerbated by the loss of his mother Julia after having recently rekindled a relationship with her. In fact, as John said himself, he felt he'd lost his mother twice. The first time was when he was only 5 years old and living at 9 Newcastle Road, Wavertree, the house he'd lived at since being born at Liverpool's main maternity hospital on the evening of 9th of October 1940. John's merchant navy father Alf, sometimes known as Freddie, was away on a ship and missed John's birth. Alf has received a lot of criticism over the decades for the way he seemingly abandoned John, and on the surface, without a lot of real evidence, that criticism could be justified. And certainly John felt that way towards his father. Though John wasn't always given the full facts, as we'll discover later. And there does seem to be another perspective on why Alf was absent. Julia's family despised Alf because they thought he wouldn't work to provide for Julia and their new son John. Julia's sister, John's Aunt Mimi, was particularly opposed to Alf, and Julia's father demanded that Alf present something tangible to clearly illustrate he could financially support Julia. Remember, this was during the Second World War, when well-paid work was hard to find in those days. Alf's only available solution was to sign on as a merchant navy bellboy on a ship bound for the Mediterranean, though this meant he would have to be away at sea for much of John's early life. As time progressed, Alf graduated from bellboy to steward during the many months he was away. Initially, he sent money every month to Julia to financially support her. Once, whilst on shore leave in Liverpool, Alf even auditioned for theatre manager roles but had no success, and had little choice but to go back to sea. 9 Newcastle Road, Wavertree wasn't just John's first home. It was literally where his life began. He was conceived there during January 1940, when Alf was on a week's shore leave from the Duchess of York Merchant Navy ship. Incidentally, in 2013, the house on Newcastle Road was bought at auction for £480,000 by a very wealthy anonymous buyer that described herself as a John Lennon and Beatles superfan. That £480,000 sum was over 3 times the asking price. Clearly, the house meant something very important to the mystery buyer living in America. Though she's not stated it publicly, even during her visits to the property shortly afterwards with her son Sean, it's widely known and accepted the anonymous purchaser was in fact Yoko Ono. Years after he finally lost his mother in a road accident, John said he felt he'd lost his mother Julia twice, because he lost her initially when he was only 5 years old at Newcastle Road. One time, whilst on shore leave, Alf took the infant John to Blackpool, ostensibly for a day out. However, being suspicious, John's mother Julia confronted Alf in Blackpool because she believed he was planning on taking the 5-year-old John to live in New Zealand with him. A row erupted, with Alf demanding the 5-year-old John choose right now who he wanted to be with. When the event is presented like that, it's hard to fathom what sort of person would force a distressed 5-year-old to choose between his mother and father in this way. Surely Alf must have realised the lifelong emotional damage he was forcing on his terrified son. However, it's possible Alf was emotionally damaged too, after being brought up in an orphanage after he was too abandoned as a young child. It's reported the distraught John twice chose his father, but subsequently broke down in tears and ran after his mother. The distress caused to John was too much for Julia's sister Mimi to tolerate, and as a result, with other factors, Mimi made steps to gain full guardianship of John. Julia very reluctantly agreed to let her sister Mimi look after 5-year-old John because her own lifestyle and mental health precluded her from being able to give him what he needed. Looking back on his life a few years before he was murdered, John said, "I lost my mother twice, once as a child of 5, and then again at 17. It made me very, very bitter inside. I had just begun to establish a relationship with her when she was killed. We'd caught up on so much in just a few short years. We could communicate. We got on." The early rain that fell on John's life caused him sustained pain for all of his 40 years. Even though he did experience highs throughout his tragically cut short life, emotional pain never left him. John's mother Julia had 2 other children after having John. The eldest was also named Julia, and the youngest was called Jackie. John's younger half-sister Julia later spoke about the shared intense pain they all felt after their mother was killed by a policeman in a road accident. Young Julia said, "John was 17, I was 11, and Jackie was 8 years old. All three of us were devastated. The impact on our lives is endless. It went on for John until he died, and for me and Jackie, it still continues." Lennon's songs such as Mother, Julia, and My Mummy's Dead clearly illustrate the raw pain that never left John. John's rawly recorded songs My Mummy's Dead, committed to tape at John and Yoko's rented home at 841 Neames Road, Bel Air, California, and Mother are notable because they not only feature John crying for his lost mother, it's the only time we hear him shrieking, "Daddy, come home," to the father he frequently said he despised. These songs weren't the first time John exposed his pain. Long before solo John exposed his raw pain to the world on My Mummy's Dead and Mother, the never-ending emotional pain he suffered was lyrically evident in upbeat Beatles songs such as Help. In fact, Lennon had originally wanted Help to be recorded as a ballad, or at least at a much slower, more melancholic tempo, but he was pressured into making it up-tempo so it could be a single. Intriguingly, though long accepted to be a sole Lennon composition, probably because we only hear his singing voice on the recording, McCartney does claim to have helped John write Help. Was that Paul again aligning his emotional trauma with John? Years later, when she had become a special needs teacher just outside of Chester, John's younger half-sister Julia wrote about the pain they all felt in her book. Imagine this, growing up with my brother John Lennon. She said, "Having my mother, loving her so deeply and then losing her, has given me my most intense happiness and my most bereft sadness. Like any child who has lost a beloved parent while still very young, the happiness and sadness of her memory are inextricably linked. When I had her, I wasn't aware that things could change. Like any child, I was simply living life, as I had always known it. You don't know that life can be snuffed out in the blink of an eye until it happens. I was 11 years old when my world turned inside out, when my mother, after whom I was named, was killed when she was hit by a car on a July evening in 1958. As a teenager, John was close to his younger half-sisters Julia and Jackie. After the Beatles broke up and John was living in America, there was a period of time, quite a prolonged period of time, that John phoned Julia every week. Julia said John only ever wanted to talk about their mother. There was also other deep sadness in their lives. John, Julia and Jackie had another younger sister that had been reluctantly given up for adoption by John's mother Julia. John was unaware of this other half-sister. As I said before, John wasn't always made aware of all the facts about different and important aspects about his life. John was unaware of this other half-sister because he was murdered before the facts came to light. I'll finish up this Musical Steps episode with information about the adopted younger sister John was unaware about.